Hi! So recently I've been thinking a lot about diversity and equality and how it's very important for all of us to just start really accepting and acknowledging diversity and celebrating diversity and the differences in all of us and how beautiful it is to be diverse and different and just have all of these unique things about us. And a big part of that, I feel like with future generations, is that it's important to start teaching how important diversity is at a young age. And I really feel like that starts with children's literature. So personally, I grew up with a mother who is blind. And, it was always very normal for me because, I didn't know any different. And, I just had nothing else to compare it to, so it wasn't different for me. It wasn't odd. But once I started going to school, it was odd whenever I would try and explain this to my peers. They simply didn't understand how my mom's eyes didn't work. Throughout my whole childhood, and even now as an adult, I still receive a lot of questions about what my mom can do, what she can't do. Just like with all diversity, and especially looking into handicaps and different impairments that people experience, that a lot of children and even adults aren't familiar with. I also remember growing up that I didn't see in the media, in books, in TV shows, anything. I didn't see something that was similar to my mom or my family. So therefore, a lot of people would have been confused, whether they be my age or older, just because they haven't experienced what I have. So that's why I decided I'm going to see how visual impairments and blindness are depicted in children's literature, if at all. Because honestly, I have not seen much of it. So I'm going to be talking about 3 specific books today that I read and looked at that do depict visual impairments and blindness. 2 are novels, and then 1 is more of a nonfiction informative picture book. So the first book we are going to be talking about is R.L. Stine's Into the Dark. This book was published in 1997, and even just by the cover, we can look at this and realize that R.L. Stine, he probably didn't really consult with anybody who works with people who are blind or visually impaired, or talk with anybody who is. This cover seems, and the title of the book seems fairly insensitive, in my opinion, because clearly the title is called Into the Dark. And then also, if we can talk about how it says, "See no evil." This book is a part of R.L. Stine's Fear Street series, which is meant for older audiences, but still children's literature. So not only based off of the cover that we just discussed, also going into the novel, it's fairly clear that R.L. Stine did not talk to anybody. He did not do a lot of research, if any, because as reading this book, there are clearly so many stereotypes that are very incorrect. So now R.L. Stine's book, Into the Dark, is about a girl named Paulette Fox. Paulette is in high school and she is blind and has been blind since birth. So now R.L. Stine focuses this book around how Paulette does not let her blindness stop her from doing day-to-day tasks and is still a very independent person, which honestly is a wonderful depiction to have in the story, and how, it's very true that people who are blind can still definitely be independent, and it's great, and they're taught how to be independent while living with a blindness or a visual impairment. Now, in typical R.L. Stine fashion, this book is of course on the spooky side. So in this story, Paulette falls in love with this guy, Brad. But all of her friends are basically saying, hey, he's a bad guy, you shouldn't fall for him, you shouldn't be around him, you shouldn't hang out with him, but she doesn't listen. And fast forward, Paulette is hanging out with Brad by herself, she's getting creepy phone calls from him. Then towards the end of the book, we find out that Brad actually has an evil twin brother who has been trying to ruin Brad's life for their whole lives. And so the one that's been doing all these awful things to Paulette has been the twin brother, not actually Brad. So now let's go into what exactly R.L. Stine did correctly and not so correctly. Throughout this book, R.L. Stine scattered many, many stereotypes. Stereotype number 1, touching faces. People who are blind or visually impaired do not touch other people's faces. While the media and books may lead you to believe this, that is not correct. So I'm going to read you a quote from the book where this took place. He took her hands in his and placed them on his face. Slowly, Paulette let her fingertips move over his soft cheeks, feeling the high cheekbones, the silky hair falling over his forehead, his strong, straight nose, the tiny scar by his left eye, his smooth, full lips. Piece by piece, she built up a sense picture of his face. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "Some people don't like me to do that." "You could look at me any time you want," Brad replied. So clearly in this section, she's obviously touching his face after wondering what he looks like. And then also hinting at the fact that she normally just wants to touch a bunch of people's faces to know what they look like. Which, as a sighted person, it would not be unlikely to assume that someone who's blind would want to know what other people look like. Incorrect material number 2. So, obviously in this book, Paulette has a white cane. A white cane is something that people who are blind use to help guide them around and make sure that they are aware of their surroundings and to help them navigate independently. So when R.L. Stine wrote about Paulette having a white cane, he did describe some of it correctly, such as the purpose for the cane and how she used it and what places she used it in. However, there was one part where she was getting out of the car, and he described it as she was bracing herself with her cane, meaning that she would have pushed down on the cane to help her get up. Now, a white cane is not meant for pressure to be applied to it. A white cane is simply meant to help guide the person along in their path. It is not meant for pressure to be applied to help support your body weight. So when R.L. Stine described Paulette getting out of a vehicle and bracing herself with the cane, this honestly would have simply jammed or broken the cane. Because the canes are honestly fairly flimsy, and most of them are meant to collapse, so it makes it easier for them to be portable. So this honestly is not correct, especially for a person who would have received orientation and mobility skills. Orientation and mobility, or O&M, is a profession and practice where people who are blind and visually impaired are taught how to navigate on their own in their environment. So Paulette would have received this instruction considering she's been blind her whole life. So therefore, she would honestly know not to brace herself on her cane. Incorrect information number 3. There was the high school ring that was dropped inside of Paulette's room whenever Brad, or actually the evil twin, had snuck inside of her room. The evil twin had planted the ring there to try and frame Brad to make it look like Brad was sneaking inside of her room in the middle of the night. I'm just going to read a small quote from this part of the book so you can know what I'm talking about. Paulette began to explore the face of the ring with her fingers. It is a signet ring, she realized. Paulette traced the initials carved on it. B.J. The initials were B.J. B.J. Brad Jones. So we're all familiar with signet rings and high school rings, and how small a ring is in general. So therefore, would it even be possible to feel that tiny of a print on a ring? Just as an example, there's no possible way she could have felt the letters. Now, obviously, a person who is blind or visually impaired could identify letters in print. However, there is no possible way that she would have been able to feel on that ring that it said BJ in the tiniest engraving. R.L. Stine definitely did go off with the fact that she would have had heightened senses. Her other senses would have been heightened because her body and her mind would have made a compensation for the fact that she was blind. Which, to an extent, that is true. There is no possible way that I'm done with this one. Incorrect information number 4, and this one's another stereotype. Throughout the book, R.L. Stine references how Paulette counts her steps everywhere she goes. Simply counting her steps and how many paces it takes to get from one place to another, and she just has all of these numbers in her head. Because of course, you're going to walk the exact same pace in the exact same way from point A to point B every single time. For example, she held her breath and listened carefully, straining every sense. She didn't hear another cough, no footsteps, no one breathing. Paulette picked up her pace. I'm going to pause. If she's picking up her pace, therefore her footsteps aren't going to be the same as normal, and so therefore there's not going to be the same amount of footsteps from point A to point B. She picked her way along the broken sidewalk for 17 steps, then turned into the yard. She felt the weeds and dried grass brush her ankles. It's 25 steps to the front porch, she remembered. It's just that throughout this whole book, it's just she's counting steps, and she just remembers how many steps it takes. It's not consistent. It doesn't make sense. They don't teach that in O&M skills. It's not a thing. Now, I will say, in this book, there are a couple things that R.L. Stine did depict correctly. For example, he described how certain things in Paulette's house have a very specific place and how the furniture does not move. This is fully true, and it really makes sense, because a person who is blind or visually impaired is not going to use their cane around in their own house. Another thing that R.L. Stine depicted correctly was that Paulette had a Braille watch. Braille watches are very popular, and they are an easy way for people who are blind or visually impaired to tell time without having their phone or something speak to them to tell them the time. So overall, R.L. Stine's Into the Dark is, honestly, it's not even that great of a book. It doesn't make much sense. And then also, it just does not depict a person who is blind very well. And I really think R.L. Stine could have made this a much better book if he actually did some research and talked to those who could have helped give him more information on the topic. So now I'm going to be talking about the second book that I looked at. This book is called The Danger Box by Balliett. So overall, this book just seems like there was much more research done than what R.L. Stine did in the previous book. So this book is from the perspective of a young boy who has a visual impairment. He's not completely blind, but he is legally blind. And in the beginning of this book, this author takes the time to have the boy explain really what he can see and what his visual impairment is, which is wonderful for the reader, where this is directed at children to where they can fully understand and really grasp the visual impairment that the character has. So in the beginning of this book, this author really just takes basically a whole chapter to describe how this boy sees the world. So I personally love the way the author showed this information to the reader by having the child main character explain it himself. Because one, it's nobody knows how he sees better than he does. And number two, by having a child explain it from his own perspective to the reader, who is more than likely a child, the reader will be able to better understand because it's coming from a child's perspective. It's coming from a language that they'll understand. I also love how definitely the author put in the name of his eye condition. By putting the name of the eye condition, it definitely brings a realistic point to it. And the reader or anybody else can do further research on the eye condition itself. Another point that the author brings up in this book is how people who are blind or are visually impaired do fidget and move their hands or their bodies in certain ways. These certain mannerisms are psychological habits, and they usually happen when a person is nervous or bored. I also think the author definitely describes it very well in this section of the book. If I knew I was supposed to do something, sometimes I just couldn't do it. Instead, I pressed on my eyebrows over and over, tapped my chin a million times, or squeezed my elbows. When I was real young, I screamed if my grandparents tried to stop me. Then my grandma realized that I just needed something special, something that was mine to do before the necessary thing like going to school. She tried to help me figure out a routine, like stretching my arms and legs every morning before I got out of bed, but that didn't work too well. Was it my left leg then right, or the other way around? Soon I was pinching each toe before I could put on my socks and then waving my glasses in a circle around each ear before putting them on. And if the circles weren't perfect, I had to keep waving until they were. So again, the author definitely depicts like how this is a psychological habit. Another point that I thought was very cool that this author put in the book was talking about color theory and people who are visually impaired and blind, and how, just because their eyes may not work perfectly, that doesn't mean they don't have a concept of color or color theory or light and dark. And the boy in this book does have some vision, and so he's describing lavender and the color of it, but also the smell that ties into the actual flower and how he relates it to the color. However, even some people who are almost completely blind have a large grasp and understanding of color theory. My mom, as an example. And pretty soon I'm going to talk to her and ask her some questions to where, she can further explain from her point of view how she understands these sort of things. Overall, I believe that The Danger Box is one of the better books that is fiction, that does depict a character with a visual impairment, that does have a storyline and somewhat normalizes just having a character in the story. I also think that this author did a great job of showing that they had done research or that they were aware of many things to do with people who are visually impaired or blind. So now the third book that I am going to reference. This book is called White Cane Day by Kristen Grender. So now the book White Cane Day, I also just think that this cover is really cool because it's talking about white canes, and then also the title is made out of canes. I just think it's cool. This book focuses around what the holiday White Cane Day is about. It also talks about the importance of a white cane, what it's used for. However, it doesn't necessarily have specific characters or what blindness is or what it is like to be blind. This book definitely has wonderful facts, and it's great that it's showing and sharing what White Cane Day is and the importance of it, and what a white cane is and the purpose of it. This book is definitely wonderful for representation, and I love that this book was made describing the holiday and describing what white canes are, so children can further understand if they see someone walking down the street who has a white cane. I guess personally, I just see that there's two different types of representation, where it's like White Cane Day, where it's informative, and that's great, but then there's also representation like in Danger Box, where it's just, and honestly, R.L. Stine's book too, but where it's just there happens to be a character who's visually impaired or blind. And with having those books where it's more storyline based and they just happen to have those characters, they're still very informative, and it's normalizing showing people who have those visual impairments. And also, it just helps educate those who are sighted and who aren't necessarily familiar with those who have those visual impairments or are blind. And it sheds light on the situation, so it makes it more normal, just like it is normal in day-to-day life. When I was looking online for this research, for these books, I was mainly looking up trying to find books to read so I could look into it more and just hopefully find at least several books that depict visual impairments or blindness. However, mainly what I was finding was that there were books like these for people with visual impairments or who are blind, which is wonderful and great. I fully love that there are books available for those who are visually impaired or blind, such as tactile books, Braille books, or twin vision books, or even large printed books. However, whenever I was looking at this, it was like, I was glad that those are there. However, what about the books that represent the people that read these? Where's their representation in just general stories? There's books for these people, which is wonderful. However, there's not books including these people or about these people. Throughout my research, I just basically found out that there are very few books and novels for children depicting characters or themes around blindness and visual impairments. And I feel like this goes for many forms of diversity, whether this be people who are handicapped, or whether this be about race or gender or ethnicity or sexuality. It's all just not shown. So throughout this research, I was honestly just very disappointed in my findings. However, I was not surprised. So now personally, I honestly have a couple questions for my mom, who is someone who is blind, and I would just like to see her thoughts on this, and I have a couple questions for her, so we're going to talk to her. So I didn't know if you wanted to introduce yourself first.
My name is April Laughlin, and I'm Melissa's mom. My eye condition is called Leber's congenital amaurosis. Most people call it LCA. It's a retina condition. It has something to do with blood vessels that grow in front of the retina, and they can't remove them. So I guess they continue to grow, and the light perception continues to diminish over time. I'm almost totally blind now. I have a very small amount of light perception in both eyes. Even when I was very small, my visual acuity was so low that they could not really measure it with an eye test. They called it 200. So it's like what I see at 2 feet is what someone else would see at 200 feet. My brother Clay Jeffcoat has the same eye condition. He sees a little bit better than I do, but it is genetic. My parents did not realize that when they got married that they were distantly related. And when I was 18 years old, we had a cousin who did some research of the family tree and found out that they had the same great grandmother and stemmed from 2 sisters. So they're 4th cousins. And normally with anyone else, it wouldn't cause an issue. It's that they happen to both have the same recessive gene for this eye condition. It just crossed. And there was a 1 in 4 chance that 2 people that have the recessive gene would have children with that eye condition. And my parents just happened to get 2 of us.
So in regards to the books that I was reading for this research, there was a part in one of the books where one of the girls, she had a white cane. She, whenever she had this cane, it described her sort of bracing herself with it to get out of a vehicle. And, you know, I know just from what you've told me and from seeing you work with the cane that this would not be a smart decision because it would probably break the cane. Am I correct in thinking that?
It depends on what it's made out of and how it's constructed. If it doesn't fold, she could use it and kind of brace yourself on it, but it's not going to be like a walking cane that someone would use that has the little feet on it to stabilize you and to use. If it folds and you push on it like that, either it's going to collapse on you or it can jam the cane where it won't fold up. It can damage the folding mechanism in it and mess it up. This cane is fiberglass, and it is collapsible. So, you know, it collapses like this. If you were to put weight on it, it would fall in on itself. But then you pull it open to use it, and then it has a tightening mechanism up here to stabilize it so that it won't fold. Like if you hit a crack in the sidewalk with the tip of the cane, it's not going to come apart or collapse on you. But I do a lot of just walking to and from the mailbox, walking with people, and inside of buildings, and the fact of demonstrating that I can't see. It's a good way to be able to get help when I need it, for people to know why I'm kind of feeling around and don't know what I'm doing. You know, act like I don't know what I'm doing when I really can't see, and it shows them that, hey, I'm truly blind. I'm using a cane. I do know of instances, and it happened to me in high school, that even with a strong aluminum cane that I used in high school to get from building to building, because we had a pretty large high school campus, I had people step on the end of it and break it. So it is possible. And I would think if you were to put a lot of weight on it, especially trying to get out of a car, if you take the cane, you put it out on the sidewalk, and then you start trying to lever yourself out of a car with it, I would think it would probably bend or collapse, or it wouldn't give you the support you need, and it would just fall on you and you wouldn't be able to use it. It's definitely not the same kind of cane as a walking cane.
So I have another question. In the same book, actually, they had, and I know this is, been talked about a lot in general, but just touching people's faces to know what they look like. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's an invasion of the person's personal space. I personally think it's weird. I think that the only way that I would ever do that is if it was someone I was extremely close to, because to me it is a very intimate thing, and I would not just go up to some person and feel their face. To me, that's awkward. I had one instance when I was in middle school where a teacher wanted me to feel another student's face, and I did not want to do it, and I don't think he wanted me to either. It just would have been a very awkward thing to do, especially middle schoolers. You know, that's awkward age as it is. A lot of times the way that I would picture someone is by listening to their voice, and just from things that they would say about themselves, I get a picture of them, but I don't need to feel their face to be able to know what they look like.
So really my main purpose with looking into this is just looking into children's literature and representation and stuff like that. So like as a kid, or even now, did you ever personally feel represented in any sort of media or literature in general?
Mainly when I was a kid, when you would think about books about blind people, it tended to be books that were about Helen Keller or someone who's historically significant, but wasn't in a more modern type situation. And sometimes blind people in books are portrayed sort of like superheroes. Like they've got just because they can't see, they've got some kind of supersonic hearing or supersonic smell or supersonic touch. And that's not really the case. Your senses, people think they're better, and they're not better. They're just more exercised. It's sort of like muscles. If you exercise certain muscles more, they're going to be stronger, and they're going to be actually somewhat better. Or, they're going to be a stronger muscle in your body. If you use your touch and your smell and your taste and your hearing more than your sight, then those things are going to be more acute and more well developed because you've used them more. In fiction, that's the kind of impression I had gotten, is just that blind people have a tendency to be shown as superheroes, or it's the complete opposite, and they are completely dysfunctional and can't function on their own at all, and that they rely on everyone else to help them do everything. But you do see a lot more of nonfiction with blind people, like stories about people losing their sight or being blind from birth and getting guide dogs, or going to different centers for the blind that are placed around the United States where they learned like how to live independently, because maybe they had learned all they could at home, like they maybe didn't have a lot of support at home, or that their family at home didn't feel they were equipped enough to help, so they would send them off to school to get some extra help. So you get a lot more true portrayal of blind people, I think, in nonfiction than you do in fiction, because I don't know how much fiction writers research blind people before they write books. Sometimes I think that they don't do very much research. Like they read other fiction books and think that that's how blind people are. Because I have read some stuff that to me was just not accurate. I didn't feel like it was a true portrayal of a blind person. But now there are cases that I hear of. My brother Clay has an incredible sense of direction. You start talking about a general area in Columbia or a general area in Lexington, he can tell you landmarks. He can tell you some streets that might be around that area. There are some blind people that have such a good sense of direction that if you tell them you're in a certain part of a city that they know well, you can be driving on a certain road. They can feel the texture of the road, while they're riding in the car, the way the ride feels and the way it sounds, and they can tell you what road they're on. That is to me an incredibly supersonic. It's a cool thing, but that's not of a typical blind person. I think blind people have their strengths and weaknesses just like sighted people. But I don't know if in writing, if blind people are always portrayed accurately. By the same token, I don't know about deaf people either, but I don't know a lot about people who are hearing impaired. Therefore, I'm not any kind of source to say, yes, that's true, and no, that's not true.
Kind of going off of that, do you feel like if the correct amount of information and correct facts and portrayals were put into, I guess, children's literature, children's media, or even for adults, do you think there would be less stereotypes or less questions or less confusion towards people who are visually impaired or blind?
I think so. I think it's just like any other form of media. The more accurate information that you get out there about a particular subject or a particular person or a particular type of condition, if the information is truly accurate, it's going to make people aware, and there won't be as many stereotypes or as much negative publicity that can sometimes happen. I don't see a lot of negative publicity with blind people, but there are other situations where you get a lot of negative vibes and publicity and media because people don't know. They're not educated on what they're talking about. I think that when a writer writes a book and they're going to have someone in it with an impairment, they need to talk to at least to several people about the impairment itself and how those people deal with it and how they handle it. And if the person's talking about, let's just say, blindness, they need to talk to some people who are blind. They need to talk, if those kids were mainstreamed into a school, they need to talk to some of the teachers at the school to figure out how school was handled. They don't need to just go off of what the blind people are saying. They need to get with people around those blind people to see how they react to them and how the blind people react to them and how they react to the blind people. So there needs to be some good research that goes into that. If the blind person is working in a particular workforce, they would need to go to some form of that workforce of the same kind of work and figure out how that person would do their work and how they would react to the people around them and that kind of thing, so that you get like accurate information in the books. And that way you don't have a lot of ignorance. With ignorance, that's where you get stereotypes because people don't know any better. And I mean, I'm sure I'm guilty of the same thing with other impairments that I don't know things about because I haven't been informed. So I'm probably just as guilty as anyone else if it's not about blindness.
Okay, well, that's pretty much all the questions I had. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
Like I said, the main thing that I was getting at is that blind people aren't superheroes. And sometimes in books, especially in fictitious books, you get some person that's just off the chain talented with everything. other than being able to see, and that's just not necessarily normal. Or you get the person that is so dysfunctional, and I mean, you know, in the event that they just cannot communicate, can't do things on their own. And by the same token, there are blind conditions that have other things that are stemmed to them, like maybe they can't hear well, they can't speak well, or they might have some mental impairment going on. And that's a different situation. Just because you're blind doesn't mean that you have those other things. I honestly have not read a lot of books that have blind people in them. I guess because I am blind, I want to read about other things.
Overall, after my research, I don't really see how many of my views have changed. Again, I was not surprised by my findings, unfortunately. As a future educator, I do definitely plan to have any sort of diverse literature that I can in my classroom and to include it, because not only is it important for the people who are similar to feel included and represented, but it's also important for those who don't understand and who don't see that in their day-to-day life, and so they can learn something from that literature, so then it becomes normal and a part of their day-to-day life as well, and they won't be closed-minded. It begins with teaching acceptance. They take all of this information in from the media, the books they read, their parents, their teachers, and then they take that in, internalize it, and then they put that information out into the world, into their own lives. And I feel like a big part of that could begin in children's literature, whether that be in our classrooms or just what parents and guardians read to their children. So here is to hoping, and fingers crossed, that in the future we will have a much more understanding future generations. And we can start by doing that by having much more diversity depicted in the media and in children's literature. So, thank you.